Hello, welcome back to part 5 of buying commercial real estate in Melbourne. I'm sitting here having a coffee at Lido Cinemas Arcade in Hawthorn, Glenferrie Road Shops. And of course, this is a great retail precinct, great impulse buying retail precinct. And in this video, I want to continue our discussion around retail properties and how to buy, value and assess the quality of retail in Melbourne. For those of you that watched my earlier videos, you'll remember that in part 1 we talked very briefly about the different types of commercial property, non-specialised and specialised, and we talked about non-specialised being shops, warehouses and offices, and specialised being a number of different types of businesses like petrol stations and aged care, etc. In part 2 we talked very briefly about the Retail Tenancies Act, which is the statutory act that governs most of the commercial properties here in Victoria, in Melbourne. And in part 3 we focused specifically on retail property very briefly, and we talked about the 2 different types of retail property being impulse and destination retail. In part 4 we spent some time in Grave Street, a popular thoroughfare for tourists, which is a very good impulse buying district, and we talked a lot about pedestrian traffic and some of the metrics that are really important when looking for quality retail. In this video, what I want to do is expand on that and talk about market rent, profit rent and passing rent. And I want to touch firstly on something very important, which is a term called net lettable area, or NLA. Okay, net lettable area, what is it and why is it so important? Well, it's important because it's a unit of comparison. When we're determining rents here in Melbourne, in Victoria, the term that's used to determine the floor space that the tenant occupies is net lettable area, and that's the unit of comparison that all properties are compared against. That's the unit that everyone uses. And we're going to spend some time talking about exactly what it is and how it's determined, but for the time being, understand a few things: that it doesn't include things like stairwells and common area, but it does include things like lunchrooms and offices. The net lettable area is effectively the floor space that the tenant occupies, and it pays rents in order to occupy that floor space. And that's really critical when we are determining the market rent, the passing rent, and also the profit rent. Okay, and these are 3 terms that I want to explain today. But net lettable area is critical because we need to determine what floor space the tenant is leasing, and that is the unit of comparison that is used right across the board. Okay? Okay, so let's use an example. Let's assume this particular shop here that I'm sitting in front of is 100 square meters of net lettable area, and that's the floor space that the tenant occupies, and they pay rent for the privilege of occupying that space. Let's assume the tenant pays a rent of $60,000 a year plus outgoings for the privilege of occupying this space. That gives us a net rental rate of $600 a square meter, which is $60,000 divided by 100 square meters is $600 per square meter, and that's a rental rate. That rental rate can also be used by valuers and agents in comparing this shop versus other shops, and that's, now you can see why the net lettable area is critical, because without the net lettable area you can't work out a rental rate. And the rental rate is critical because I, as a valuer and an agent, need to determine whether this tenant is paying more rent than what they should be paying, or they're paying less rent than what they should be paying. And that's really critical when talking about the next 3 metrics: market rent, passing rent and profit rent. Okay, so there are a lot of different terms that are used interchangeably by valuers and agents, and but I just want to talk about generically 3 terms that are really important. So let's firstly talk about passing rent. What is passing rent? Passing rent is simply the rent that the tenant's paying currently. So whatever the tenant's paying currently, that's the passing rent. Now we're not making a judgment whether that rent is high or low. We're simply taking the rent that they're paying and we're labeling it as passing rent. So when we determine a yield, let's say the property sells, let's say this particular property ends up selling for $1 million and the passing rent is $60,000, meaning that's the rent that they're currently paying, the property then sells at a yield of 6%. Okay, sells for $1 million, passing rent is $60,000, the yield is 66%. So when we look at sales in the marketplace, the yield that those properties sell for is what we call the passing yield. So that's the yield that the property is sold for based on the rent that's passing at the time. So passing rent, for simplistic terms, is just the rent that the tenant's paying currently. Okay, so Tass, what's the difference between passing rent and market rent? Okay, excellent question. So the passing rent is the rent that the tenant's currently paying, but is that rent also a market rent, meaning that if I was to look around the market for properties that were similar to this particular shop, right, would I find that those rents would be very, very similar? So if I find another shop with the same attributes as this shop, meaning a shop in an arcade, a shop that's 100 square meters, a shop that has similar pedestrian flow, similar location, will I find another tenant paying a similar type of rental? And what valuers do in particular, what they do is they look at what we call a bell curve. And what a bell curve is a whole lot of rents. And there are some rents that are skewed either a bit low or a bit high for whatever reason. But what we try and do as valuers is we try and look at the weight of evidence. So where is the weight? Where is the weight of evidence in the marketplace? So we look at a number of different leases that have commenced recently and we say, okay, where are those leases? Where are the rents? Where are they at? Well, what's the bulk of the data telling us? Where is the weight of evidence? And if the weight of evidence tells us, for example, that the rate per square metre for this particular shop should be more $500 a metre, so let's assume that we've done some analysis and we've come up with a rate of $500 a metre. Let's say we've looked at maybe 10 other comparable shops that can be compared one way or the other, and we've come up with a rate to say that this particular shop should be paying a rent of $500 a metre, i.e. $50,000 a year instead of $60,000. That's the market rent. So that's the rent that we've determined as valuers that this tenant should be paying in the marketplace. That rent is judged to be $50,000 or $500 a square metre, as opposed to the passing rent of $600 a metre. Okay? So that's the difference between passing rent and market rent. Passing rent is whatever the rent is at the time. Market rent is what we determine the rent to be based on other comparable evidence in the marketplace of recent leases that have commenced. Okay? Now, how does that differ to other terms like profit rent? Okay, just in summary, passing rent is the rent that the tenant is currently paying, that's currently passing. Market rent is the rent that we determine as valuers or agents that the shop should be paying based on comparable evidence. And the evidence that we look at is the weight of evidence. We generally try and dismiss outliers for whatever reason. I can talk about outliers another time, and we just focus on the weight of evidence, where most of that evidence is. And the difference between the market rent and the passing rent is profit rent. Now, what's interesting is profit rent can be profit rent to the landlord or profit rent to the tenant. And let me explain how that works. Okay, to explain what profit rent is, I just want to use an example. So this particular shop, let's assume it pays $60,000 a year. And let's assume that the market rent is determined by us to be $50,000 a year. So they're paying $600 a metre, but let's assume that we've determined that the market rent is $500 a metre. What that means is that the landlord is receiving an extra $10,000 a year in rent, or an extra $100 a square metre in rent. And that's called profit rent to the landlord. Alternatively, let's assume the tenant is not paying $60,000 a year. Let's assume they're paying $40,000 a year, but the market rent remains at $500 a square metre. That means that the tenant is paying less rent than what they should be paying, than what the market tells us. And that means that the landlord is receiving $10,000 less than what they should be receiving, and that's profit to the tenant. So here's so profit rent can be profit rent to the tenant, or it can be profit rent to the landlord. So that's the difference between the three metrics: passing rent, market rent, and profit rent. Passing rent is rent the tenant pays that's currently paying, that they're currently paying, or that's passing against this particular property. Market rent is what the market tells us that the tenant should be paying, which is what we determine as valuers and estate agents. And profit rent is the difference between the passing rent and the market rent. Now, when the passing rent and the market rent are the same, there's no profit rent, okay? So those three terms are really, really critical when you're looking at retail property. Why? Because that rent is then used to determine the value. So it's very, very important that when you're valuing a property, that when you're using a rent, it's very, very important to determine firstly whether that rent, that passing rent is actually a market rent, and whether there's a profit rent potentially for the landlord. Now, when can that be a problem? Well, let's say, for argument's sake, that the landlord has decided to spend money in order to get the rent up. So the landlord may have said to the tenant, look, I'll spend $100,000 doing a refurb for you, but you'll need to pay an extra $20,000 a year because I need to be able to get my money back. And let's say the rent's gone up from $50,000 to $70,000 to cover those refurbs. Now, when we're coming along and looking at the rent and looking at $70,000, and we didn't know about the agreement between the landlord and the tenant, we may, for whatever reason, cap $70,000 to determine the value as opposed to $50,000. So it's very, very critical that, and we don't really care what the tenant and the landlord have negotiated. What's important is the market rent. It's important for us to analyse the market rent. So, and that's why it's very, very important also, without overstating it, very, very important for those buyers who are not experienced at valuing commercial property to get a buyer's advocate. And look, simply talking to a selling agent is not really going to help you much, because the selling agent just wants to sell that property at a high price. So it's important to make sure that you have a buyer's agent who's experienced at buying commercial real estate, if not a valuer, at least to have lots and lots of years of experience to understand how to value commercial real estate. So hopefully that explains the difference between passing rent, market rent, and profit rent. And they're three terms that I'm going to be using interchangeably over the coming months. So it's important that you understand those three metrics. Okay? All right, so what we've done so far with commercial property, buying commercial property for beginners, we've talked a little bit about the different types of property and specialised, non-specialised. We've covered off on the Retail Leases Act, which governs most real estate here in Victoria and Melbourne. We've just focused so far just on retail property, and we've talked a little bit about what retail businesses look at and what are the difference between impulse buying, impulse commercial, impulse retail, and destination retail, and some of the metrics that are really critical for any retail business. Metrics like customer count and average ticket, they're really, really critical. We've talked about the importance of pedestrian traffic and how pedestrian traffic is correlated to the success of a business. And the better the business the more successful a business can be, the higher rent they can pay, and obviously the more value we can add to the value of a retail premises. Today we talked about market rent, passing rent, and profit rent, and also net lettable area. And those four key metrics are really, really critical. So hopefully you found this quite valuable. I think with my next video, I'm going to change tack a little bit and talk a little bit about factories and warehouses. We're going to come back to a net lettable area. We're going to come back to market rent, passing rent, and profit rent, because that also applies to factories and offices. But I think what I'll do with my next video, we're going to introduce factories and warehouses and talk a little bit about how when buying factories and warehouses, industrial property, how that differs slightly from retail property. Hopefully you found this video really good, and judging by the views, I think there were like 7,000 views for part 4 last time. So judging by the number of views that are viewing these videos, there seems to be a lot of interest in helping educate young Australians or Australians that are looking to invest in commercial real estate. Thanks for your time.